I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Chair, ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. I rise to support this bill. Part one of this legislation essentially is the heart of the guts of the matter, the heart of the bill, which basically sets up that the government has the ability under regulations to set an oil levy to recoup the income. Just a slight point from the last member's speech, you know, this legislation and the debate around it isn't really a question of should we have an oil stock, it's how do we fund it. And what this legislation empowers is the ability for the government to gain revenue from the customs service via a charge per litre of oil instead of the current expense coming out of the consolidated account. Now the Green Party supports that entirely. There's a number of reasons. But let's go to the big picture, which is we know how important oil is to our economy. Now I know the National members probably heard me rattle on and on about the risks of deep sea oil drilling, and what the Greens have always said though is that it's an important part of our economy. We've never said we're opposed to shallow or onshore drilling, where the data clearly shows that there is a much lower chance of an accident or a spill occurring. It's the deep sea drilling which, it's clear that based on US data, the deeper you drill, the greater the risk of a spill. What I've always said is we need a planned out staged transition strategy, because everyone from the International Energy Agency through to the OECD are all saying we're going to have to leave oil before oil leaves us. So let's do it in a planned manner. So while I've often talked about the risks of deep sea drilling, I'm the first to acknowledge the importance oil does play and has played in our economy. What we've seen, and I wish I'd brought my graphs with me to the House, is when you chart the global recessions in the last 50 years, what you've seen is, of all of them, they've been preceded by a sharp oil shock. We saw the most recent of this in 2008. So the point of this legislation in part one of this bill is to deal with the global, or the developed world response to those oil shocks, which led to global economic recessions, in some cases depressions in some countries, was the International Energy Agency's oil stocks treaties, of which we're a member. We have empowering legislation sitting on our law books to deal with carless days or other events or other strategies the government may adopt to deal with it. In New Zealand, a few years back, I actually my office undertook a study of the New Zealand economy, and what we found was every US $1 price increase in the barrel of oil, it shaved between $40 and $60 million off our gross domestic product. So we know it's important, we know it's played a key role driving recessions in the past, and for a country which in fact, despite our high percentage of renewables, 3/4, is one of the most oil-dependent developed world economies in the world. We import around $8 billion per annum of oil, despite exporting about 2 to 3 billion. Our vehicle fleet is one of the oldest in the OECD, so per capita we're one of the largest consumers of oil in the developed world, despite the high percent of renewables. It may not be a fact that many New Zealanders or members are aware of, but it means we're particularly vulnerable. And given we're a country that needs to export our products around the world, enacting the provisions as in part one of this legislation to actually set a charge on it, the Green Party believes is critically important. So we support this bill and the imposition of a charge. Now I want to address the point made by the member Ian Lees-Galloway about the cost, but first we need to look at the raw facts, which is this is simply about recouping the costs of maintaining the oil stocks. Not a question of should we have oil stocks, though I know one submitter did recommend that we should actually store all this oil in New Zealand, but I understand the estimate there of cost would be around $20 million. Already the costs of the 90-day oil stocks are rising from between 5 to 10 billion, or doubling by 2016-2017 from 2012-2013. So it's a clear cost that needs to be borne by the taxpayer. We think costs should fall where they lie. Secondly, it's a question of transparency. Mr Speaker, there are all sorts of costs and expenses the government's got to account for. We think it's fair that the taxpayers should be able to see exactly where it's coming from and where it's going. So we think it's fair that there's an element of transparency for any petroleum customer or user in New Zealand to see the cost of maintaining that oil security stock supply overseas. Thirdly, it's an economic signal. Now, it's not exactly a huge one. I understand it's on the order of 0.045 cents per litre of oil. It's not really going to have an impact, particularly not on the scale of the price reductions we've seen over the previous few months, Mr. Chair. But, Mr. Chair.
Gareth Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think it's fair that, and appropriate that there is an economic signal for the cost of maintaining the oil stocks. But I do want to pick up on the point which fuel poverty is a genuine and real issue in New Zealand. The data is a lot more common for electricity, where up to potentially a quarter of New Zealand families are in energy poverty, spending more than 10% of their disposable income just to keep the lights on or keep warm. I'm not aware of any data for oil consumption, but I'm sure many members read the recent story about the worker I think from Auckland, who was literally walking for about 5 hours a day to get to work. We know energy poverty is a real issue, but I wouldn't say subsidising energy, as other countries are doing and the IEA are actually recommending against, is the answer. I don't think we want to spend taxpayers' money to make oil cheaper. What we want to do is give people choice. We want to give people options to get around their cities or towns or regions safely, cheaply and fast. So what we did see in the last recession was in fact very little choice for Kiwis. In my hometown of Wellington, they literally went to the Railway Museum and pulled a unit out of stock because of the demand on the railway, because of the price of oil. In my hometown of Gisborne, where I grew up, people wanted to export their products on the rail line to avoid the high oil costs. Couldn't, because the rail line had shut and there was no funding to reinstate it. So we support the legislation and the idea of actually costs falling where they lie, because it is fair, it's transparent, and I would note an issue of equity. For those, say, superannuitants who can't or won't drive, for those students who can't afford a car and prefer to bus or train, for people for a lifestyle choice have decided to not purchase a car or use oil, I think it's important that they are not the ones bearing the cost of all the oil stocks. I think it's an issue of equity, sending a price signal, and that's why I just wish, Mr. Speaker, this part one was more substantial, because as The Economist magazine points out, this is a fantastic opportunity with the low oil price to actually address some of our structural dependencies on oil. We're one of the most oil dependent countries on an oil dependent planet, Mr. Speaker, yet we've got one of the least effective emission trading schemes in the world, sending that price signal few. Sadly, part one doesn't deal with biofuels, which is an issue which sadly wasn't addressed on the Select Committee. Biofuels will be covered in this legislation and face the same charge, despite the fact that biofuels actually support the energy resiliency of New Zealand, lessen our dependence on foreign offshore oil stocks. And I note the submission of the likes of Z Energy saying that it was a counterproductive measure. And I note with the latest data which has just come out, which I've received from the Parliamentary Library, the percentage of New Zealand biofuels has actually fallen catastrophically in the last 7 years, from a high of 1.2 million litres to less than a quarter of that today. I think policies have played a role, the lack of an effective carbon price has played a role, and this further more punitive measure is further going to dampen demand, because I think all members in this Parliament and parties should be able to agree, if it's sustainable, if it's not competing with food, we should be encouraging biofuels if it has a net reduction of carbon emissions. And it's good for Kiwi workers, it's good for Kiwi farmers, it's good for Kiwi petroleum users. So I think this is a point which may be picked up in the debate today, why biofuels haven't been exempted from this charge, given other products have. I think it's bitumen, LPG, but biofuels aren't. So it'd be good to get a contribution from the Minister or the national members to address this point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.